We're very excited to welcome you here to this reimagining of the MPavilion program in a repurposed car park. This was Melbourne's first multi-level car park, built in the 1950s, and it's a real privilege that we are pretty much opening our parkade season welcoming the architect himself, Peter McIntyre. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, create and share experiences tonight, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and the Yalukit Willam of Boomerang as the traditional custodians of the land. The Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and the Yalukit Willam Boomerang are two of the 5 major language groups of the Greater Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. And we also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands for anyone who's watching a recording of the events today. Tonight, we have filmmaker Toby Reed, who is going to introduce the evening's proceedings, and we'll be seeing the film Peter and Dione McIntyre, 1950 to 1960, Counterbalancing Forces. Then there'll be a discussion between a talk by Peter McIntyre, and then we'll be screening Your House and Mine, the 1954 film made by Peter and Robin Boyd. So it's a real treat, and I'm really looking forward to the evening, and I'd like to hand over to Toby.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Jen, and all the MPavilion for organising this. It's really been great that in this idea of repurposing a car park, Peter has become the sort of 2020 MPavilion architect, which is kind of interesting. I think that's really great. And we've been working on this film for about 5 years nearly now, and before that we were doing films on a lot of other people in Melbourne, but I kept saying to everyone, look, the person I really want to do is Peter McIntyre. You know, I really want to make a film on him. And then the opportunity came, and every 6 months or so we get together and we do a bit more filming, and so we keep adding to it. And last time we showed about 2 years ago, it was very much a rough cut. So hopefully those of you who were here then will actually see a difference between the two. I want to thank John Gollings in particular for coming along and helping with extra footage for this new cut as well. Okay, so let's go. Good. Thank you.
I was very influenced by Graham, not to look at magazines and overseas people. Well, no, I wasn't really influenced by overseas people, no. So I've been working in an architect's office for 86 years. Well, from 1934 up till now. They say, well, we can't believe it. What do you mean 86 years? You're 110. And I say, no, but I started when I was 7. Well, I was trained in the functional school, and we just believed that we had to use the modern materials that were available to us, and we had to let them express themselves, and we had to see that a building functioned. And of course the tragedy of those days is that function was just considered as physical function. It wasn't anything to do with how you actually felt. And the result was that we ignored how much energy we were going to use. We used far too much glass. We were using new materials that hadn't been used before, so our buildings leaked. It was a pretty difficult period. I started at the Melbourne Tech. It was called the Melbourne Tech in those days, it wasn't RMIT. Did 3 years there, and then I went to the Melbourne University Atelier, had a year at the Atelier, and then the final 2 years I did under Brian Lewis's new scheme. Boyd and Grounds were the people that influenced me most in those final 2 years. What they taught me more than anything else was to be inspired by architecture. Up till then it was a pretty dull sort of situation. I'd had a sort of a life as a child in my father's office, which was pretty dull, and then RMIT was pretty dull, but I got inspired when I met Boyd and Grounds. Grounds was very adamant that we shouldn't be looking at architectural magazines. I don't know why he was like that, but he was adamant that we should just be sort of inspired, get our own inspiration somehow or other. But he was quite adamant that we shouldn't sort of study overseas architects. Well, I think Grounds had an ego that was so large that it didn't actually fit into the studio, so we did a lot of work outside. So I think it was because of his ego that he had that attitude. I thought that geometrical period of his architectural career was derogatory to his career. I didn't think that worked. Any geometry that I have introduced is flown from the actual structure. Boyd was an entirely different man to Grounds. He was gentle, much more imaginative than Grounds. Grounds was earthy, and he would go to a job and he'd draw his details on a lump of 4x2. Boyd, on the other hand, would sit in the Age Small Home Service. He would have one of those telephones connected to his shoulder. He'd have his secretary, Grace Muir, taking down shorthand. So he'd be taking telephone calls, he'd be doing details on his drawing board, doing 4 things at once, and then I'd come up to him and say, there's a new Australian lady that wants to buy a house at such and such and wants this, that and the other, do you think we can do it? So he'd answer me, and take the telephone call, keep doing the detailed drawings and keep dictating to Grace Muir. Now Grounds wasn't like that at all. Grounds was, as I said, earthy and more sort of dominant. In a way, Boyd was gentle but incredibly imaginative. He was subtle. He would say things to you which you didn't quite get at first, and as you walked away you'd suddenly realise that what he said, what it meant. Our nickname for him was razor blades, because when you cut with a razor blade you don't actually feel the cut at first, but then 5 minutes later all the blood oozes out. He was like that, he was subtle. It was a marvellous period when Gropius came here. He went down to the McCutcheon house down at Mount Eliza, I remember. He was very taken with the terrace houses. He loved the Australian terrace houses. Never been close to Harry. I don't think Harry liked my work at all, so I think that was the basis of why we weren't close. I was breaking his code, and that's why he didn't like me.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a modern house, but there's nothing like Boyer or Gropius. There's nothing like anything. I think it was because I didn't have the hang-ups that Seaside came in that background, and it was entrenched into him that this was the way to do things. You know, he was absolutely like a priest, you know, preaching, and any variation of it had to be destroyed. The first client I ever had, I had many in my father's office, but the one I actually got for myself, he inherited the block of land in North Balwyn, but he hated North Balwyn, he hated the suburbs. So he asked me to design a house for him where he wasn't looking at the suburbs. So I designed it so it was looking at the sky. So, and I was, even at that stage, I was into, because I'd been influenced by our last year in doing structures, I was introduced to post-tensioned and pre-tensioned reinforced concrete. I was interested into balancing forces. In the early 50s, there was a tremendous shortage of material, and everyone was looking at ways of designing buildings which reduced material. And the idea of counterbalancing forces, which ended up in the principle in the pool, was something that we could reduce the amount of material. So even in that first house that I did, the counterbalancing of forces principle was used. It was a cantilever and balanced by a floor beside it. We won the pool in December '52, and in '52 I had designed the river house. The river house was that period of counterbalancing of forces and reduction of materials, and the river house had a situation of where the site was on the bend of a river, and the river was going to rise 40 feet, so it was going to be a platform somewhere up in the air, and the question was how do you actually get it there? Conventionally you'd have a series of 30-foot poles. That's what Grounds did over there in the triangular house, on a steep site, and poles going down 30 feet. But I managed to work at a part of the site where I could take two cantilevers and they could balance each other. The river house was designed well before I ever did the Olympic pool design. It was very interesting because there's a book being published of Boyd's letters, and in that publication, now it's going to come out, Miles Lewis is doing it, he's editing the letters. There's a sketch that Robert has done of the river house. I must have shown him the design of the river house, and he has sketched it in his letter writing to Clarion in New York, and that was predated the swimming pool design. So I was balancing forces before we ever got to that swimming pool design. So I've been doing quite a few designs on counterbalancing forces before we ever came to the pool. I first met Dione when she was a first-year student, and I put her in the review. She came down when she was doing fourth year and asked for a job, and we said, yeah, have a job. And what she did on the river house was to invent the colour scheme. She actually, the famous sketch of the river house with that colour, it was done by her.
I was experimenting with the colours and which way the red and yellow triangles were to be arranged. That was one of the sketches. And
Tell them the story about when you asked me who's going to live in the house.
Oh yes, well, it goes back a bit further, doesn't it?
She was working on it, and she said to me, who's going to live in this house? Who's the house for? What are you planning to do? And I said to her, look, the office was down in St Kilda Road, backing on Faulkner Park, and I said to her, let's go out to the park, and I want to see you out there. So we walked through the office back to the park in the back, and we sat on a council seat, and I said to her, I'm going to ask you, will you marry me? And we both live in the house. And she said, yes, I'll marry you. And so I actually, when she was doing the colour scheme, I actually asked her to marry me, and on our 60th anniversary we went back to the back of that park, and the seat is still there. And we sat on the seat, celebrated the 60 years of marriage with her. Yeah. But she's a great designer, and she designed a lot of buildings with me after that. We were a partnership, and even now today, when I do something, we work together still.
The patterning on the facade was determined by the structure, obviously.
Yes, it just emphasises the structure. It just follows the bracing, the structure, and so forth. And we didn't quite realise how the effect that the colour would have. When we were doing it was in spring, and all the leaves were out, and the whole site was concealed. But if you look out the window now, you'll see there's not a single leaf on the thing. So we didn't understand that in winter, every leaf drops off, and you can see the thing from the bridge. And we were absolutely horrified because the tram used to stop And people would all look, tramps on, they'd look to say, what is it? It's like something landed from Mars. Boyd loved the river house. The essence of the Olympical design was, how do you make the cheapest possible construction? The competition conditions stress that, and the form was literally given to you. The pools, sizes and location were fixed, 5,000 seats side beside them, so the form was given. So the question was, how do you construct this building in the most economical way? And because we had been working in relation to counterbalancing of forces coming from precast concrete, pre-stressed concrete and post-tension concrete, we started to use that principle. The first competition was the stadium at Carlton, and Grounds and Boyd asked us as students, Murphy, myself and Borland, we were all friends with them, they asked us to join them to do this competition at Carlton. The design that we produced was a very sensitive design in its geometry and things, but it wasn't an inspirational design. I think Grounds must have sensed that before it was lodged, he pulled out of the team. Boyd was asked to be one of the judges for the Olympic pool. So Murphy and John Murphy, myself and Kevin were, Phyllis was pregnant at the time, 5 months pregnant, but we were left, we were the team that was just left. Boyd and Grounds had gone away because he thought the design for Carlton wasn't that good, and Boyd was appointed judge, so we were just left. So we started working on that design, and it came automatically, the idea of counterbalancing forces, because they actually gave you the form. I mean, there was a swimming pool, fixed dimensions. Beside it was a diving pool, fixed dimensions. So that was there. They wanted 5,000 seats looking at it, side by side. That was, so the form was actually given. You had to use that form. The question was, how did you build it? And they emphasized that it had to be, was the most economical way of constructing it. There's a huge amount of criticism in Melbourne for having the games, because we weren't putting in infrastructure for houses. Houses were being built on the edge of Melbourne without roads and without sewerage, and people were writing the paper saying, why are we spending money on Olympic Games when we should be providing accommodation for people coming back from the war? So, reducing materials, the form given, here is the form, here is the pool. How are we going to reduce what's the most economical way of constructing this? Kevin's office and my office was in the basement of the building on the corner of Drummond Street and Victoria Street. And on the top floor, it was a terrace house. Top floor was Mockridge, Mitchell and Staley. Then there was John and Murray Daly, engineers, structural engineers, and we were down in a cellar. Kevin and I were in a cellar. And that's where the counterbalancing of forces was looked at. And we used to have lunch with one of the employees of Irwin's, of Murray Daly's office, Bill Irwin. And he was absolutely wanting to help us. He thought, yes, this is a great idea. And without him, we couldn't have done it, because he did all the mathematics to show that we actually reduced the steel by 1/3 of the total tonnage. And Murray Daly, who was his boss, was saying, look, there's only one way to construct this. You take the columns supporting the seats 2/3 up the span, and then you arch across, and this will give you the most thing. We reduced that normal structural design by 1/3. And we put in when we put the submission in, we put the computations in. Now, this is a very unusual thing to an architectural competition, to actually submit the structural computations. But we knew that Professor Francis, Professor of Engineering, was on the judging panel, and we reckoned that he would understand what we've done, and he did. He went through the computations, and he told the others on the thing. He said, "This is a brilliant design." And they said, "You sure it'll stand up?" He said, "Yes, it'll stand." Well, he said, "Not only will it stand up," he said, "but if it fails, it'll spring up in the air, fly away." So that's the background of how we did that pool. And it really, therefore, it came from our final year instructors. Murphy and myself were in the final year, Borland wasn't in it, but in that final year instructors, we were fascinated with the principle of stressing pre-stressed concrete and post-tension concrete. Post-tension, where you put the tension into it after it's constructed, and pre-tension before. And very interesting to know whether the Olympic swimming pool is a pre-stressed structure or a post-stress structure. I've always designed it as a high tensile steel post-tension structure because we erected the girders for the seats propped up, and then we hoisted the truss up and then connected the truss to the girders so that we were tensioning it after we'd put it up. But you could almost conceive that as pre-tension. I'll never forget the design of the Coil house. It was designed for a family called Snellman, and he was a Dutchman who'd come from Indonesia just during the war. And they had this block of land in Heidelberg, in King Street, Heidelberg. And I was interested in using precast concrete. There were sort of precast concrete small blocks that were there, and I designed this house based on precast concrete. And I made a model of it. And they were living in a flat in East Melbourne, and I took the model along to their flat and showed them the model. I was very proud of it. And I'd come to the site by tram, and they didn't like the design at all. And I said to them, well, look, don't worry, if you don't like it, I'll design something else for you and I'll bring it tomorrow. And then I left the flat and I walked over and I was standing at the tram stop and it started raining. I'll never forget it. It's because I saw the model actually disappear in the rain in front of me. And I went back to the home or office, I don't know where I did, and there was a huge tree. I decided to design the house around the tree. So it was just designed tonight. I went back the next day and showed them the design of the house going down the tree. And they accepted it, they liked it. So that's how I saved the job. The Bill Hospital was designed after we'd won the pool, and I designed it down in the office in St Kilda Road. Again, it was the Counterbalancing Forces. The site was a unique sort of site. A brutal sort of weather in Beulah. It was dust storms because the melee was eroding, and intense heat, lack of water. And because of the heat, you know, the foundations of how buildings, the tremendous earth movement in things. So all these things meant I had to sort of find a way of saving all the water. It became a job that was, it was like a pioneer job from the point of view of environmentally facing up to the rigor of the thing, because I made all sorts of passive systems to keep it cool. There was no labour you couldn't get a builder in Beulah. Where could you get a builder to build it? So I had to sort of design it prefabricated. So it was prefabricated. It was a steel frame, the central water tank. It was in two parts and was a steel, it acted as a structural steel column, and the steel girders radiated out. The steel was fabricated in Melbourne. So the steel was all brought up to the site, fabricated, so the whole structure was erected in steel. The radiating girders were held by cables, that's where the reversal, the counterbalancing forces came in, because the latter part of the girders were cantilevered. and then I applied louvers to those cables, so the whole roof was in shelter. The whole roof was caved in, so radiating into the column. So every bit of water that ever fell on the roof went into the column. The top of the steel column had a windmill on it, so that it pumped the water from the lowest part of the tank up to the upper part of the tank. So it was gravity feed water to the rest of the hospital. It was an inner courtyard, so getting away from the dust storm, so the whole circular hospital operated into the thing. The Star House, that's the Brunt House over in Studley Park. I was trying to get feelings into the spaces of the house. It was facing west. The reason why it has this serrated thing, it was facing west, looking on the river and the golf course. Well, the plan shape emanated from taking the western facade, front face, and breaking up the facade, which gave me the basic shape, and then the rest of the house flowed around it, flowed back into the rest of the side. That's how I got the shape. I'll never forget when Boyd and his wife Patricia came out to the Brunt House, which we were just talking about. She walked through it and she said, "This is the greatest thing since sex." So it was her description of it. Well, Robin was devoting his life to trying to influence the public. He would do absolutely everything he could. He'd write articles, he'd give lectures, he would appear on radio interviews. He had a marvellous strip in The Age where he'd write every Monday for the Small Home Service. And in 1956, it was just the beginning of television, and he was very friendly with Hector Crawford, and we invented a machine, a winding machine, that we would draw on long strips of paper and wind it past the camera for television. All sorts of things like this we were doing. And we started making films together in the Architects Review. My first Architects Review was 1948, and he was tutoring, and I asked him to start writing some verses and things for the reviews, which he did. Back in the early 50s, Robin and I made this film called Your House and Mine with Eric Kerr, cameraman, and we just used to shoot it in the weekends when we weren't working, and we'd just take shots here and there and put it together. We had roughly a script when we started, and we used a guy called Horton from the ABC to do the over voice. We thought that the film would be able to be, we had great aspirations for the film, but it didn't actually, it wasn't used for television, for example. We thought it might have been able to be used for television, but it wasn't. But we eventually, what happened after making films was we decided to get into planning. We decided that the houses and things we were doing and the articles and the writing and the things we were doing weren't influencing enough. So we thought that we'll try to get into planning, and we had an international architectural conference here in Melbourne and we went to Dick Hamer, who was Premier, and we asked him if we could take a town, some chunk of land, and design a satellite town. Boyd died on a Friday night, and the conference started on the Saturday morning. And from there, I kept going into planning. I ended up working in the Melbourne Strategy Plan, and we tried to influence Melbourne at that level. I'd like to go skiing. Yeah. I'm going to go as soon as Toby asks a question.
Pretty great.
I thought it was great. Well spot.
Okay, so we have Peter McIntyre here, and Peter wants to give a little talk on his, I suppose, his reactions to the work that's been discussed and what happened later, because as he said in the film, he's been working as an architect or in architecture since he was 7, so it's like 86 years. My film really just covered 6 years, so I think there's another 80 that he can cover now. Okay, Peter.
Ladies and gentlemen, why on earth are we here sitting in an old 60-year-old car park on the 7th floor when we're up at the Paris end of Melbourne and it's a beautiful Friday evening? And you know what we used to do on Friday evenings? Thank God it's Friday. That used to be the saying in our office. As we looked back on the work that we'd done for a week, and the weekend was coming up and we were looking forward to it. But we all know exactly why we're here. MPavilion have us here because the world is in crisis. And it's in crisis because of the virus. But it's tragic to think that 2.9 million people have been killed so far by the virus. But we're looking at a problem perhaps even greater than the virus. The virus might be overcome, but we're looking at global warming. Now this has got a question mark on the planet and our very existence here. In the last 7 years, Melbourne has increased its temperature to figures that have never, ever been recorded. And we're seeing the result of the combination of our extreme weather and conditions, and we're seeing what's been happening to the city in this last 12 months. People have not been happy in the apartments. They've been too small, and they're leaving them, and they want to build houses. Borrowing for building houses has increased in this 12 months 24%, while at the same time the rents of the apartments has gone down 27%. And this exodus from the centre is an example of how our lives are going to be changed completely. I'm sorry I haven't been holding this the right way. So I hope you heard some of the things I said. I don't know. I can now hear my voice. What are we going to do about all that? Well, the world's population lives in cities. 55% live in cities all over the world. And it's forecast that in the next 30 years, that's going to increase to 68%. But something absolutely peculiar in Australia is that we live in cities. 86% of us live in cities. And these cities are going to be subject to the same growth as they are throughout the world. So the amount of people living away from cities in Australia is going to be minute. And we have to face the problem of our cities. Would you mind if I sat down? I'm pretty old. Now, the film that you just saw, made by Toby, was in between the years of 47 to 69, 1947, 1969. And every one of those buildings, every one of them, has failed. And it's failed because in that period, that 23-year period, there was a sort of a concept. I don't know whether it was a worldly concept, but it was certainly a concept existing in Melbourne. And the concept was that if you had a problem and if you solved it, I'm not just talking about architecture, it happened in all sorts of fields. And you would solve the problem and you'd allow something for the future, but we were never imagining how the world was to change in the next 30 years. Just think of how it's changed. Running an architectural practice like I do, it is absolutely as if I'd gone to the moon to practice architecture. It is, I can do a working drawing and send it to China and talk to them half an hour later. I mean, it is just extraordinary. And that's going to have a huge influence on our life. And that sort of concept was the reason why I say these buildings failed. Because in their time, they were regarded as outstanding buildings for one reason or another. And they didn't face up to what the changes came in front of them. And I'll give you an example. We'll start off with the building that you saw that was described to you in detail, the Beulah Hospital. What happened to the poor old Beulah Hospital? After a short time after it was built, a couple of years after it was built, the medical practice changed. The systems within the hospital changed. The hospital had to be extended. But I'd designed a building never to be extended. This was a building right for all time. And this was the ingredient in all the buildings that you saw in that period, including my own house. I designed it as a bachelor. I didn't have any connections to anybody as a bachelor. Then I got married. Then, unbeknown to me, I had 4 children. And then, what could I do? I filled in the balconies. I dug underneath the house. I did absolutely impossible things to try to survive. And even in a building like the Olympic swimming pool. Now, the Olympic swimming pool was acknowledged internationally. This was a method of construction that had never been constructed before. And it had international praise. And Robin, who was over in America at the time it was being built, was sending back cables telling all the publicity it was having in America. But it failed. Now, we knew a bit about the future in the Olympic pool. We went to John Cain Sr. and we said to him, look, pools can't support themselves. What we need you to do is we need to have a floating floor. My swimming pool friends over there know all about the floating floors. We're doing a floating floor in the Yarra for people to swim in. And he said no. He said, we cannot spend 1 penny more than what the minimum building is. He said, I'm a politician. People in Melbourne are very, very angry we're having the Olympic Games, and we can't spend it. What happened to the poor old pool? It was turned into a music hall. Kevin Borland turned it into a music hall. And you had to sit in the pool seats, looking at the pool, and then turn your head sideways to look at the music down here. Well, it didn't last too long as a music hall. And then I was given the opportunity, because I was associated with these people, to convert it into a accommodation for a football club. And we were lucky enough to get the most favourable, the one that everybody loves, the Collingwood Football Club, into the building. Exactly. I knew how popular it is. Now, I had to put the air conditioning where we sealed off the seats. I had to put the air conditioning on the side balconies. We filled in the pool. We had a small pool. The poor old Olympic pool had to be wrecked. And that little house that you saw there, the Snellman house, the same. I think it's gone through 5 architects trying to work out how to extend it. I started the first one. They didn't like my design, and have gone through many other architects. And when I went out to that site just recently, with Toby making something, I saw how they were trying to extend it. And the poor architect had gone into all sorts of contortions. Those buildings had failed, and that's why I say they had failed. However, the sort of concept that I've talked about also was moving into other fields. In 1954, Melbourne engaged consultants and through the Melbourne Metropolitan Waterworks to produce the 1954 plan for Melbourne. It had the same sort of concept behind it, that what they were going to do was produce a plan for Melbourne, all time. It zoned Melbourne into residential, where the houses were, industrial, where the factories were, and commercial, where the commercial part of the shops were. And they were never to mix. They were never to mix. They were to remain in their zones. The thought of actually having a house somewhere where there was a shop was not a concept to be had. And they did put a green belt around the perimeter. The city wasn't going to grow a little, well, it would grow some, and there was some ability to expand, but we were designing a plan for a city that was stable. Nobody, all those engineers and planners had, again, the same thing, no idea of what we were going to face as a civilization and change. So, what happened out of that? Well, you've seen how, on the screen, how Boyd had been devoting his life to trying to convince Australians to respond to the environment and to use modern methods of construction. That's why he loved the Beulah Hospital. He planned the Beulah Hospital was to be the new Australian architecture. I wish he was alive to see what's happened to it. But he said, look, I've done enough in writing books, running the Age Small Home Service. He said, I think we've got to get into planning. And that was mentioned in the film, I noted. And we went to Dione together, and we said, we've got the film, Toby was wrong. I was walking around the site not quite saying what I was meant to say. I didn't really understand you were recording me. But it wasn't an international convention, it was the Australian convention. All the architects were coming here for 1 week, and we usually used to call those gin and tonic weeks. But we decided that we would go to Dione and get some fringe land and design a town. And we'd have all these architects coming from all over Australia, and they were going to work for a week. And you did hear on the down screen, you upped me in advance. Boyd died on the Friday night on the operating table. He had endocarditis, and they took all his teeth out. And he had a heart attack, and he died. And had a stroke, and he died. And we knew he'd want us to carry on with the thing the next morning, and we did. We carried on with a week of work. We designed a town for Sunbury. But we designed it like architects. We designed it like this wasn't a town, this was a big building. We got a brief, a shallow sort of brief about what the city required. We worked out where the houses were, we worked out where the commercial parts were. There wasn't industrial at that stage in Sunbury, but we allowed provision for it. But it was just as if we were designing a house or a very complex hospital. It wasn't as simple as a house, very complex hospital. But everybody liked it. Looking back on it, it was disastrous. So I got to thinking, after Boyd died, and I was left alone, and I looked at Sunbury, and Melbourne at the time, the centre of Melbourne, was in dire crisis. Because when they produced the plan for Melbourne, they didn't include the central area of Melbourne, controlled by the Melbourne City Council. They gave that what was called an interim development order, which meant, it said, in Latin, it said, you can do any bloody thing you like. The whole place is yours. You can build anything you want to. And what the Melbourne City Council did is they allowed St Kilda Road to become a commercial centre. St Kilda Road was full of very old mansion houses. And they were pulled down, and high-rise office buildings were built, and huge parks underneath them in the ground. And that was absolutely ideal for a city that was crazy about motor cars. People could drive from their house to St Kilda Road relatively easily, go straight into their car park, get into their high-rise office building to their office. But what that was doing, what was not understood, in a city, if you do something in one spot, it's going to affect something else in another spot. And what was happening is people were bleeding away, exiting from the centre of Melbourne, where all the major physical activities were. I mean, that's where our major hospitals were, and all that stuff, everything else. They were leaving that and going to St Kilda Road. Now, this was a complete repeat. It was what happened in Los Angeles and Wilshire Boulevard. Wilshire Boulevard, running from the centre of Los Angeles down to the sea, became like a St Kilda Road. And the centre of Los Angeles went into total decline. That was exactly the same thing. Well, you must think we had a beaten path to Dick Hamer, because I went to Dick Hamer again. He wasn't Premier, unfortunately. He was Minister of Planning. And we said to Dick, do you realise that the Melbourne City Council, with its interim development order, is not working with any sort of scheme plan at all? We want you to actually write to them and say that they really must prepare a scheme, must prepare some planning for what they're doing. Now, I had been reading about things in planning, trying to see how we could do something different, how we could solve it. And I learnt that there was a famous man, called Otto Königsberger in University College London. And he had invented a process called strategy planning. And I delved into this to find out what strategy planning was. And he was implementing strategy planning in Singapore. And I had an architect who used to work for me in my office, practicing in America, Des Brooks. And we would speak to each other, and he was in touch with a lot of American planners. And when I learnt about the strategy plan, I said to him, we must get the Melbourne City Council to do one. And eventually they decided they would do one. We formed an international group of planners to come here and work with George Connor, the economist, Australian economist, and myself. And we submitted a tender, and we won. And it was inevitable that we'd win because we knew how to do it, and we could put a very economical tender in, and we did it. And it was successful. Incidentally, just before we'd done that, the authorities had engaged American planners to build a plan of freeways all over Melbourne. And the plan was carving through all the residential areas radiating out from Melbourne. Now, we're talking a lot about Boyd tonight, but he had invented a marvellous word to describe what Melbourne had been doing. He called it austerica. This was a combination of Australia and America. And as he defined this word, austerica, you can actually Google it, ask them, what's austerica? They'll tell you Boyd invented it. I know because I did it this morning. And how he defined it was, if America is doing something like building freeways, and then they discover that they're not working as they imagined they were going to work, then Australia, 10 years later, would start to put in freeways. and then if they'd find out 10 years later that they didn't work, that was austerica. And this plan absolutely just decimated the residential areas of Melbourne. These freeways radiated in all directions. Luckily, it was never implemented, not before we got to work introducing strategic planning to Melbourne. Well, the strategic planning that we did, what is it? What's so magical about strategic planning? Well, firstly, it had a fundamental understanding that a city was a living organism. It was a living thing like an animal, like a human being. It was alive. If you touched it here and did something there, it affected something here. And it was in a continual state of change. Melbourne, for example, is not like tonight, like it was yesterday. Something's happened. It's moving, it's doing something all the time. People are building, people changing ideas all the time. And the strategic plan by Otto Königsberger, the process, he understood this clearly. And when I brought him here, and I think there'll be a photograph of him here tonight. He's a brilliant man. When I brought him here, he walked around Melbourne for a week. And he said, Pete, he said, Melbourne has got 3 major important characteristics. He said, firstly, you've located a huge amount of variety in the central area of Melbourne. You've located all the things that need to have access, but where the public have got to get to them. Even the taxation office. They're all there in the centre. And he said, the second thing is that it's compact. Very, very compact. Just walk from one end of New York to the other and you'll see how compact Melbourne is. It was laid out by Robert Russell, an architect, laid out Melbourne. He was sent down from Sydney by the chief planner, and that's a uniform, normal, commercial layout of an English marketing city. Wide streets, the little streets, the one behind me, were for servicing. They've never been for servicing. We use them. They're as popular as the big streets. Now, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Now, he laid out Melbourne. And Otto Königsberger said, it's compact. But he also said, the third one, I nearly fell over. He said, it's accessible. I said, Otto, I've brought you here because it's not accessible. He said, you've got a train system. And he said, I've looked at it, and it's unbelievable. Now, I'm going to tell you about the train system. You would all heard of the land boom, where the government built railway lines radiating out from Melbourne, well beyond where Melbourne had houses, radiated these rail lines all out from Melbourne. In the 1990s, Melbourne had more rail network per population, per head of population, than any city in the world. But we weren't using it. We were in love with motor cars. And there'd been never any upgrading of the signal system, never upgrading of anything, of the carriages or anything else. But the rail was there. And it was going to be possible, he could see immediately, that we were going to be working towards how we could get the rail working. And at the time, of course, it was just proposed when we were doing this work that the rail underground in Melbourne was going to go. Now, this was in spite of most of Cabinet being against it, but the Minister for Planning pressed ahead with the idea of putting the rail under Melbourne. And everybody thought that this rail under Melbourne was for just going, if you're up here in Spring Street, you catch the train and end up at Spencer Street. But it wasn't for that at all. What it did, and you won't believe this, it doubled the capacity of the rail. And how did it do that? In Melbourne, before the underground was done, trains would come in to the major station, Flinders Street. The trains would unload, and then the train would back out over the same line it came in. Can you imagine what that did to the network? The train had to get out of the city before the next one could come in. What the underground did is the train comes in, it unloads, off to the other side of the city and housed on over there. So we promoted the underground rail. We did everything we can. I think as probably a present, they gave me the Parliament station to design. And I said, thank you very much. But I had problems there, which I'll tell you about. So we completed the strategy plan. And we ran through the whole process we went, and you've probably had Zach the process on, haven't you? No, you have. We can go back to it. I'll talk about it. We went through this process with a public participation program, and this was the really very important point for its success. And at every aspect of the whole process, we had a whole network of people forming committees and having constant meetings with them. And of course, this consultation was something absolutely new to Melbourne. Governments weren't inclined to do much consultation back in the 1969s and things. They just made decisions. But this was the process that we went through. And it's not an elaborate process. It's quite a simple process. It almost follows a process that architects follow designing buildings. We would gather the data, the information about the city. So what's different between doing that for a building and doing it for a city? There's one hell of a difference. Because there's so much information in the city, that you have to be expert to know how to pick out the relevant and important information. And that's where these international planners experienced were absolutely supreme. They could do that. And then after you had that done, you then tried to ascertain what the problems were. What was the problem that we were doing? And of course, the public participation were marvellous in giving us the problems. They actually experienced the bloody problems of the city and knew about it and could talk about it more than engineers or anybody else. So we got immense knowledge from that. And then the next stage was what is the most difficult thing in planning a city, the constraints. We had to understand what it was, the areas we could not go, the things we could not do, but the things that we could do and how we could do them. These constraints are very important. And then we would come up with tentative ideas of what we were going to do and spread them around for discussion. And then after that, a very important phrase, the evaluation. We'd assess it financially, assess it socially, assess it at all levels of activity. And evaluations were done after scheme. And we submitted 3 or 4 options to the public. And we evaluated them, told them what they were. And we ended up making the publication. It was so successful that every city in Australia undertook strategic planning. Old Otto's influence just spread throughout Australia. But this is all old hat. This is all very old hat. This was done 50 years ago, and I am very old now. Since then, there's been an immense advance in planning. Immense technology alone has given us things that we can get more information than ever. Your planners in the city of Melbourne know more about Melbourne than we'll ever have known. And I'm going to recommend tonight, I started off with the idea, I said to you, we're here because there's a crisis. We've got technology coming out of ears. We don't know what's going to be next. What are we going to do? We've got a brilliant planner in Melbourne, Rob Adams, down at Melbourne City Council. I'm saying that we should take the planning in the state government level, where my daughter is a planner. That's how I know it's brilliant. And we should take that department, and we should take Rob Adams' department, and we should bring them together, and we should have, either at Australian government level or at state level, they should be commissioned to form a team of international planners to work under them and to start a new plan for Melbourne. Because we're facing such influence to change this city, and the cities are going to want to grow even further. That green belt we had in 1954, it's now got 1,000 million houses over it. And the city is going to grow onto. Think of what happened in America, where they linked Boston to Washington. Houses all the way. It's called Boswash. And that's what will happen. I've already named it, Melgie, Geelong and Melbourne. There'll be houses right along the highway. So that's my recommendation. I hope Rob Adams is here tonight. You might pat me on the back for that recommendation. Now, when the strategy plan's finished, you then go into, of course, action planning. You then implement what the policies and the goals that you've established do. And that's where planners, urban design planners and architects start to implement. Now, just as I said, planning has changed over that 50 years, so has architecture. Are you going to show some buildings? Yeah, okay. There's an international movement now. It's called the Architecture of Psychoanalysis. Now, the Architecture of Psychoanalysis studies and starts to understand the link between people and the hidden emotions they have in their brains, the memories they have in their brains, the imagination they have in their brains, with the built environment, that link and how they relate to each other. Now, the first thing saying that, you'd say, well, look, all people are different. And they are. Everybody's got their own DNA. But there are things that you and I are carrying in our brains which come from thousands and thousands of years. I'll give you the most common one. Fear. People are fearful when they get in a dangerous situation. That's not something that was just invented. We've carried that for thousands of years. And there are a series of absolutely fundamental emotional things that we have in our brains, and our buildings need to respond to them. What buildings are you showing, Zach? Showing, okay, this is my house, a little baby house I built in Mornington. One of my favourite things about this, it won the Robin Boyd Medal. And I would have been so proud of Rob being alive to know it. But it had emotion. It had emotions. I'm sorry to be upset. It had emotions in it. And when people go into it, it's so powerful with its emotions. They carry it away in their mind. But show me the Trinity Grammar School Library. Trinity Grammar School Library is a much more impersonal building for me personally, because it was done under a most brilliant man, a headmaster. The headmaster at Trinity Grammar School was one of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. He knew the personal name of every one of the 1,200 students in that school, and he knew and had studied what they were like, and he used to see them at lunchtime wandering around the school. The only prize for the students, was in their classrooms, and they'd lock them up at lunchtime. So they used to walk around. Some would play on the ground, some would go to the little library they had. They would do different things. And he studied it. And he gave me a brief for this library. And I couldn't believe it. He was actually talking about psychoanalytical architecture. He was psychoanalysis architecture. He was studying what people were thinking in their brains and what they were wanting. And he gave me the opportunity to design one of the best buildings I've ever designed in my life. And it's Trinity Grammar School, and it's open to the public. And I'm not going to describe it to you now because words would bring it down. But it's a building, if you're interested in buildings, you must go and see. Trinity is so proud to show it to people. But the students, they like it so much, they've come in at 7 o'clock in the morning so they can get into it. They have to open it up early before the school starts. And when the school finishes, they stay back at night till 8 and 9 o'clock, so they have to turn on dinner. It is the most successful thing I've done. And I'd like to finish on that note.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. That was fantastic.
Look, I do really want to apologise. I really don't. I do a lot of public speaking, and I really don't get upset like that. It's just that, you know, we've been talking so much about Robin tonight, and Robin meant so much to me. Please excuse me.
We'll do a few questions now.
Now, Toby has arranged that Toby and I can answer any questions that you might have. And if you haven't, we'll resume to the bar.
Peter, I've got one. I mean, we've talked a lot about a lot of things, but like Kevin Borland was someone I knew quite well when I was young, and I went to Press Hill, and so there was three buildings. You know, Kevin designed the Rice House, you designed the Belford Community Centre, and Robin Boyd designed the Jordan Vale shops and houses. So I was just wondering, how did that come about?
Well, that came about through the builder of the Olympic swimming pool, McDougall on Ireland. You can get back further back than fall back.
Even more. I'll tell you if you're going to fall.
Okay.
It's all right.
And he had brought a patented method of construction that he brought across from Mexico. It was called shell concrete. And he asked if we would design a couple of buildings to our clients using shell concrete. I did the Belfield Community Centre, near like a housing commission estate. Robin did 2 shops in, what suburb? It's
I don't know.
I don't have to find
I think it's on High Street.
Somewhere up beyond Malvern. It is.
Yeah.
His 2 shops, if you want to see.
It's a Celebrate, what's it called?
Kevin
Liquor store now.
Kevin Borland, he was the most experimental one. He did a house for a family called Rice. And this construction was the shelf arch form thing like this. And he wasn't content with that. He did the Rice House arch, right down like that. And of course he created all these box gutters. And from the moment the poor Rice family occupied the house, they knew where the shower was. They had 4 showers at every box gutter. And Robin and myself and Kevin used to go out every Saturday morning with a bucket of bitumen and paint the box gutters, trying to stop them leaking. I've never built a box gutter since.
Okay, and how about the early schemes for Press Hill? Because we've got one picture in there of your scheme for Press Hill, and I know you and Kevin both designed one, and then Kevin won the job. So just wondering if you could talk about your scheme.
Well, if you know Press Hill, it's a very built-up site, and we both had children. I was born right next to Press Hill, McCartney Avenue, so I knew a lot about Press Hill. And my wife, we were the first people to take children back to Press Hill, and they asked Kevin and myself to design a hall, and Kevin produced a sketch of the hall in amongst all the existing buildings, and I went to the front lawn and put the building underground, and they selected Kevin's building. So that's the story there.
All right, and just one last one before we get the audience to ask you questions. About 18 months ago, we went to your office's 100th anniversary party, and you had some great stories just about your early childhood working for your dad, the type of work you did, how you copied drawings. I just wondered if you could describe your life as a 7-year-old architect.
Well, when I say I started, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, because I did go there at 7 years of age, and I was the gopher. My father used to work almost exclusively in hotels, and the drawings had to when they were produced, had to go to the solicitor's offices before they could go to the licensing court. And I was the gopher. We were in Henty House in Little Collins Street. I used to go down the lift to the sandwich shop in the basement, and I'd take all the orders for the boys, and they'd write them down, and I'd give them the paper, and they'd make the sandwiches, and then I'd bring the sandwiches up. That's where I started. As I got a bit older, I delivered drawings to the lawyers' offices, and the other job I had was when a new job came, we were doing a lot of little hotels, like in Fitzroy and Carlton, and you'd be a typical intersection of a street where there'd be four hotels, one hotel in each corner. And these little hotels had domestic-sized rooms in them. But what happened is when they brought in 6 o'clock closing, the hotels had to be, the bar area had to be expanded because they only had the hours between when the men knocked off and when the 6 o'clock closed, so they needed bigger bars. So our jobs were invariably to knock out walls and make the bars bigger. I used to go over to the licensing court, and this guy there, Arthur Dixon, in charge of the court, was in the Somme battle with my father. And so therefore, you know, we had a very good contact there. So he would bring out the drawings of the new job we'd get. Of course, every hotel had to lodge their plans with the library, and I would trace them, and then I'd take it back to the office and draw them up. But I was about 12 by the time I was doing that. That's what you mean? And I did become the expert sun planner. We were just after the Depression, and everything was very valuable and precious. And I became the #1 sun planner. You'd take the tracings, it was a timber frame with glass, and you'd take the tracings and sensitive paper, put the two together and clamp them into this frame, and then you'd hold them up to the sun. Because the difficulty was, how long did you hold them up to the sun? Because if you held them too long, they would burn the whole frame out, and if you got them just right, you put fixative over the print, and you could take it down. I could produce blueprints and die lines. I became expert.
Okay, I mean, put scanning into perspective, but... anyway, any questions from the audience at all before we get a drink?
I've silenced you all, and I do apologise to you also many times. No questions. Let's go to the bar, and I'd like a drink myself. Okay?
I've got a question over here.
Perhaps we go with one question, then, yes, relax into conversation.
I was just going to ask what your link was and how you got involved in Alpine architecture and...
Yes. Well, look, I advised all architectural students to start understanding that they're going to practice where they like to have their recreation. You know, if you like playing golf, get to the golf club and you'll become a golf architect. I went skiing when I was 17, I think. Yes, 17. I joined the University Ski Club, and I went to Bulla, and I made my own skis, and I converted football boots to ski boots, and we went to Bulla, and left at about dawn in the morning and driving up, and got to as far as the White Bridge, and then we walked for about 3 hours, and then I slid down what was a little clearing in the trees where Burke Street is, and I went down once, and then I walked for 3 hours back to the car. And that's when I started skiing. But it actually captivated me. And because I liked it, and I've always advised students, start to actually where you like to spend your life and doing things, that's where your practice will be. So I've become an Alpine architect because I've just been skiing all my life. Is that the explanation you wanted? I might say the gentleman that asked that question, he's a client of mine. So we are doing floating pools in the Yarra. Is that right? That's right.
Well, Peter McIntyre, thank you so much. You have laid down the gauntlet for a series of conversations that will take place here in your car park, which is now a cultural laboratory, over the next 2 months as we imagine what the post-COVID city of Melbourne will be. And I can't express enough how grateful we all are. Thank you so much. Now, thank you. And since 2017, Toby Reid has brought film to the MPavilion program, and we're forever grateful for that as well. Thank you so much, Toby and Anna.